chance now to the Opposition Leader Malcolm Turnbull for his thoughts on this global financial crisis and how Australia is weathering the storm. Mr Turnbull, thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Can I start with the same question I asked the Prime Minister? In simple terms, how do you think this crisis came about and why is it affecting all of us?
Well, over some years, far too much money was lent in the United States to people to buy homes, those people not being able to repay the loans. People with poor credit histories and so forth. This is what subprime loans are. Now that everyone was happy, everything worked out well as long as house prices kept going up, as long as the bubble kept on growing. But when the bubble burst, of course, those loans, the house prices went down, and they've declined in America by more than 20% in real terms since from the peak. But of course, the subprime loans went bad. Now, in the meantime, they'd got themselves onto the books of banks all around the world. They'd been turned into very complex derivatives, many of which had been given ratings, credit ratings by credit rating agencies that were far too optimistic. And as a result, we had big losses from banks, uncertainty about the extent of each bank's losses. Banks then lost confidence in lending to each other. Money supply or money flow, the flow of money, what economists call liquidity, started to dry up, and that's basically the origins of it.
One of your predecessors, John Hewson, says the resources boom is over and Australia is heading for recession. Is he right?
Well, I wouldn't call it, that. I wouldn't call it that. I wouldn't call it like that now. One of the things we've got to recognise is this is a rapidly changing situation. I have been critical of the government for not seeing the warning signs from the beginning of the year, and you may remember, I think in fact I did it in an interview with you. I was flogged almost by the government and economic commentators for daring to say that the subprime crisis in the States was going to put enough dampening pressure on the economy such that we shouldn't be putting up interest rates. Now, Mr Swan and Mr Rudd went off with the inflation genie out of the bottle, and I think Mr Rudd's phrase was the inflation monster. And so they talked up inflation and talked up rates at precisely the wrong time. But in the last few weeks, of course, last month, really since the collapse of Lehman Brothers in September, things have gone from being bad to very much worse.
Well, the Prime Minister has now put a $10.4 billion stimulus package on the table that will flow through the economy in the coming months. He's accused you of flip-flopping on this. He's questioned whether you support it or not. For the record, do you support this package?
Well, of course we support it. I mean, you'd really think that the Prime Minister could spend his time more productively answering questions in Parliament instead of misrepresenting the opposition. Of course we support the package. We said we supported the package. But he's become so impossibly vain that anyone who asks him any question about it, is seen as being opposed to it. Now, we support it, but the opposition, the Parliament, is not meant to be a compliant and obsequious cheer squad for the Prime Minister.
If it was you in government, you'd structure it differently.
Well, we've said that if we were in government, I said no doubt we would have structured the components differently.
What would you have done?
David, we're not in government, and so it's not really productive to go into that.
Well, to say that you would structure it differently means that you take issue with some of the structure.
No, it's not a question of taking issue with it, David. Look, let me give you an example. You want to put let's say you want to put $10 billion, 1% of GDP, into the economy to stimulate, growth, to ensure, or at least to ensure that growth doesn't slow unduly. I mean, nobody thinks the economy is growth's likely to accelerate. So you've got to form a view as the government about what growth is going to be next year in the absence of that stimulus, correct? Right? That's the question we've been asking the Prime Minister. He refuses to answer it. He refuses to give any answer to that.
Well, his answer is the Treasury gives a forecast every 6 months and the next one's due in a month, but there is other advice out there from the IMF.
But you see, this is where, look, he's either being disingenuous or he doesn't understand what he's talking about. The IMF said that, and indeed the Reserve Bank has said, that growth next year, when they said this, some weeks ago, they said growth next year will be in the order of 2% plus. Okay. If you really thought growth was going to be, in Australia, 2% plus next year, I don't think you'd be spending $10 billion in a fiscal stimulus. The government must believe that growth is going to be less and possibly a lot a lot more less. So a lot less. Now that is the that's the reality. Now what we've sought to find out is what are the assumptions they're working on. They haven't just. I'm sure this is
but
not
why
just.
Can't you wait for the Treasury assumption next month?
Because they've made the decision now. And by the way, this money will be spent in the first week of December. This money will be out the door. I think it's about 2.5 weeks before Christmas. It'll be gone. The only part that won't be spent or won't be in people's hands or pockets by mid-December is the additional payments to first home savers. But the bulk of it will be in the economy in December. So they've had to make a decision now. It isn't unreasonable for a diligent opposition supporting the package, nonetheless, to ask some questions.
But they're doing it sitting around the table with Treasury. They're not flying blind here, are they?
Well, we hope not. We hope not. I mean, I'm asking them the questions. I mean, they're the ones that are sitting around the table with Treasury. What has Treasury told them? Everyone's entitled to know. I mean, look, can I just say this to you, David? It's not just a question of the stimulus. The big issue for many businesses and many families is interest rates. Now, what is going to happen with interest rates? How confident is the government that this package will not make it harder for the Reserve Bank to lower interest rates?
The Treasurer says he is confident of that.
Okay, well that's good. We'd like to know why. We'd like him to explain that. We know, for example, that the recent cut in interest rates, the 1% cut in official rates, has not been passed on to most business borrowers. We checked around with the banks today, and as far as we can tell, only one of them has passed it on to their small business borrowers. Now, that means that the stimulus from the interest rate cut, and that is a stimulus, is not finding its way yet into small business, the sector of the economy that employs most Australians. So Mr Rudd is providing deposit guarantees to help the banks. He's providing wholesale term funding guarantees, which, by the way, put the taxpayer potentially on the hook for many billions of dollars. So that's a big question we've asked him about. He's doing all that for the banks, and then he's spending $10 billion in a stimulus, but the stimulus of the interest rate cut is not yet, apparently, finding its way into that part of the economy where most Australians are employed.
The Prime Minister has also asked for tougher rules on executive salaries. You were a former executive chairman of Goldman Sachs.
Yeah.
Do you think executives such as yourself have earned too much in those roles?
Well, I just want to make this clear. Right through my career, for most of it, almost all of it, I have been I've either run my own business or been a partner. When I was at Goldman Sachs, for most of that time, I was a partner of the firm. So when the firm did well, we all did well. When it didn't do well, if it didn't do well, we didn't do well. So the real issue is with executives in big companies, typically public companies, and concerns that people have had is that the incentives are wrong. I don't think Mr Rudd really understands what the issue is. And if you've got time, I can explain what it is.
Well, he's saying it's the bonuses you get for taking risks. That's the problem.
Yeah, again, let me explain it, because I don't think he's explained it properly. In financial services businesses, people are got a job of making loans, acquiring assets, making loans, making investments, okay? And if they get rewarded for making those loans or bringing that extra business through the door, but then aren't held to account for any losses those loans might arise down the track, you get an incentive to keep on writing lots of new business without regard to how good that business will actually turn out to be. And that is real. And it's a difficult one.
That's what you've got to
crack down on. Yeah, and it's not easy, by the way. I mean, it is very much.
But you're open to reform on this.
Well, can I tell you? I have thought for many years. I mean, you go right back to 1991 or 92, it might have been, when I was a shareholder of John Fairfax. Shortly after Conrad Black had taken it over, I took the board of Fairfax to court because they were giving options to the executives at $1 when the stock price was $1.50. So I have been, unlike Mr Rudd, I've actually got form in holding excessive executive remuneration to account.
Before we go, the budget, I was asking the Prime Minister about whether he would be prepared to go into deficit to avoid a recession. Would you?
Well, I think we'll address that circumstance actually rather than hypothetically. I mean, the fact is that we built up in government a very strong surplus. We paid off all of Labor's debt. We set aside the future fund to cover future obligations and we ran very strong surpluses. The only reason Mr Rudd can write this $10 billion cheque is because John Howard and Peter Costello put the money in the bank.
Nothing in principle wrong with going into deficit where necessary.
Governments have gone into deficits when necessary, but the real question is it necessary? And I have to say that given where Australia is starting from today, we should aim, and the government should aim and be held accountable for this goal. They should aim to stay in surplus. We've got a very strong economy, and that should be their aim. And you know, what Australians are looking at now is they say, OK, we'll take you on trust for your $10 billion in stimulus, and we're doing that. But the government needs to be accountable. It needs to tell us what the basis of that decision was. They've refused to do that, and they need to tell us what impact they think it will have. And they haven't done that either.
All right. Opposition Leader Malcolm Turnbull, thank you very much
Thanks,
for joining
David.
us.